Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our very last session of Disability Awareness Week 2022. So my name is Peter Santiago, and I'm the Associate Director of Accessibility Services. We're the office on campus that supports students with disabilities. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from land that was stolen and rightfully belongs to the Lenape people. It is my sincere hope that there is some way that we as a society can find a way to make amends to the generations of indigenous peoples that have been forcibly removed from their lands and worse. This year for Disability Awareness Week, we chose to celebrate the whole person and the myriad of intersecting identities that are often overlooked in people with disabilities. Our hope is that this week's events will help to shape attendees' perspectives towards a strengths-based and holistic understanding of the identities of people with disabilities. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Victoria M. Rodriguez Roldan, who is a Senior Policy Manager at AIDS United, where she brings her own unique intersectional specialties to the fight against the HIV epidemic. Her particular areas of expertise and focus are the intersections of issues affecting people living at the intersections of transgender identity, disability, and mental illness through a social justice lens. She frequently speaks on discrimination issues impacting the trans and disability communities. She has been profiled in multiple national media outlets and has been published in multiple academic journals. Prior to joining AIDS United, she was a senior policy counsel at the National LGBTQ Task Force, where she led the Trans GNC Justice Project and the Disability Justice Project. She currently serves on the board of directors of multiple disability, LGBTQ, and social justice nonprofit organizations. Victoria holds a BA in psychology with honors from the University of Puerto Rico and a JD from the University of Maine School of Law. She has lived in the DC area since 2014. Welcome, Ms. Rodriguez Roldan. I very much look forward to learning from your vast experience and expertise. Thank you for joining us.
By the way, we have a few people in the waiting room that I just admitted. So,
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope everyone can see this.
Yes, we're good.
How much time do we have to speak?
We have till 4 o'clock.
Okay, so I usually try to take less than that, sometimes significantly less, to open it up for questions. So there is an extent to whether we stay the whole hour depends on you folks, the audience, basically. So yeah. So with that, I call the presentation the slide Disability Intersectionality. So as I like to say, who am I and what am I doing here? When I wrote that slide, I wasn't assuming that I was going to have my own bio read. But personally, I am Latina, Puerto Rican, and a lawyer by trade, focused on disability policy, lobbying in the DC area with government. And I'm also autistic and also identify as someone with mental illness, bipolar specifically. So that is where a lot of my interest comes, and a lot of my research is precisely on the intersection of race and gender with disability, basically. I would say a note on language. There's both identity first language and person first language when it comes to disability. Person first involves saying, for example, people with disabilities, whereas identity first uses the word disabled. Many activists, myself included, rely heavily on identity first language and use the word disabled because it is both an integral part of our lives. So I'd be a very different person without my disabilities. And it is not a bad or immoral thing. You shouldn't be reminded, you shouldn't need to be reminded of the person in order to respect their humanity and validity as human beings. Say the word, there shouldn't be any stigma to it. So I think a question sometimes I like to open in for people to answer, what is disability? There are multiple models that try to define disability, be it as a medical thing, which is summarized as something to be cured, the charity model, which is the victims that we need to treat, to help out, and so on, and a civil rights model. But most importantly, I try to define disability as something that exists outside of society's perception of normal. We might assume that the normal is they have 4 limbs. So people who exist outside of that definition are frequently those who are labeled as disabled. Why am I saying that disability is socially defined? Think about the fact that people generally don't think of themselves as disabled because they wear glasses like these, despite the fact that my life would be very, very difficult if I didn't wear them. But how is that different from a hearing aid, who a deaf person or hard of hearing person would be considered disabled, societally speaking? That is like the societal question. And in fact, with more common disabilities, we often see that people rarely use the word disabled to describe them. For example, heart disease or diabetes. So people often don't think of themselves as disabled because they have diabetes, or think of the loved one that has diabetes as disabled. So I want you to examine a bit, why do you think of that? Why is it socially acceptable to call one thing a disability and one thing as not a disability? And thus we go into what is the intersectional view. To be very honest, a lot of the historical disability movement, very focused on rights, legally speaking, was historically very pale, stale, and male, to be very honest. Very white, very privileged. In the process, I say that we have a stereotype of disability as something separate from racial justice, from LGBT justice, and other issues. And in the process, we have this mental image of the otherwise photogenic white person in a wheelchair, basically, which is entirely leaving all the people who actually live at the margins of the margins, or the least privileged people with disabilities, disabled queer people, people of color, immigrants. For that matter, I sometimes talk, which I mentioned in the slide, the non-sexy disabilities, basically. But I say that there's sexy and non-sexy disabilities, in that the sexy disabilities are the ones that people like to show in the group picture to say how inclusive they are of disability. For example, the person who uses a wheelchair. The non-sexy disabilities is the ones that look bad, quote unquote. For example, mental illness. And when I say mental illness, there's a whole other category in there, because when we talk about mental health awareness, often people only talk about, say, anxiety or depression, but start backing away slowly when you talk about schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychosis, and so on, the scary stuff that people want to lock people away for. Intellectual and developmental disabilities like autism, Down syndrome, I can keep on going. Disabilities that impact presentation, like your appearance, like facial deformities, stutters, and so on, speech issues. All of those are the ones that are even most stigmatized. The non-sexy disabilities, that when you do the group picture of the organization that works on disabled people, they don't put those on the front of the group picture, as I like to joke. So that is one of the categories I talk about a lot. And sometimes I talk about hierarchical ableism, basically, which is like the idea, like, for example, if you have a physical disability, maybe, I don't know, you have chronic pain or cannot walk, whatever. We could write a whole library of what constitutes a disability. If it's physical, you might get told well, at least you're not crazy, for example. So that creates a whole hierarchy of let's be less towards the more stigmatized illness. Then again, I've also gotten the, as someone with a mental illness, I've gotten the reverse. At least you can walk, for example, and so on. Which also erases all the people who have who are multiply disabled, who have all those various disabilities. And I believe in that sense, mental health disabilities are essential to see in the context of physical disabilities, because considering the exclusionary way the world treats people with disabilities, it is inherently traumatic to live in the world, be treated in the world as disabled, and in the process creates its own trauma-based mental health disability. Next slide. Why is it so important to treat disability as a racial justice, gender justice issue, and so on? For example, and I published this in the American University Journal of Gender, Social Policy, and the Law. If your CUNY login lets you access time online, you can get in. If not, I'll send it to you and link it to you on SSRN. Trans people are more likely to identify as disabled. For example, 39%. 20% of the total population, according to the US Census, is considered disabled. But when we did the US Trans Survey of 2015, the 2021 was delayed by the pandemic. Hopefully they'll do it again soon. 39% reported having more than one disability, compared to that 15 to 20%. Indeed, when we go to sexual orientation, the Movement Advancement Project reported around the same few years, 40% of bisexual men, 36% of lesbian women, 36% of bisexual women as having a disability. So I try to say it applies the same thing. While a significant amount of those disabilities, it's not necessarily that you're more likely to have what I call the more innate genetic born disabilities, but say trauma-based disabilities, PTSD. It's why we talk so much about there's a 40% suicide attempt rate among trans people, because society treats us like shit, forgive the language. And when it comes to racism, it's very closely intertwined. One publication that finally came out in the Drexel Law Review in Philly that I wrote is that, for example, if you're familiar with Kendra's law in New York State, which allows for what is called assisted outpatient treatment, which is the euphemism for involuntary court-ordered treatment, that is outpatient instead of being inside a hospital or an institution. A majority of the people under those court orders in New York State, not even New York City, which is much more diverse, are classified as Black and Hispanic per the own statistics kept by New York State health authorities. Like my entire research was based on the entire set of statistics kept by the state of New York on their website. And in that sense, that creates a big question, which is, okay, majority have schizophrenia and so on. Where are all the white schizophrenics, basically? Like the majority, even people under the age of 25 that qualify per the Affordable Care Act to be under their parents' health insurance are on Medicaid, which is pointing to systemic poverty among the population that is in there. Since we could say adults, well, they're less likely to be able to work because of their disability. So I would say one of the things that comes to mind is, you say, where are all the white people? Where are all the more affluent people? They're being seen by private providers and are not being activated by police, because the majority of the cases then go into then are referred by law enforcement when people make calls on 911 calls on a mentally ill person. So essentially, I try to argue in my journal publication that that the entire involuntary treatment system has essentially become an extension of the overarching policing against Black and brown people. Basically, it's a form of control, much like we see in the carceral setting, and much like in the criminal legal system, and much like we see even in family court when it comes to child protection services with Black and brown mothers and Black and brown families, since you rarely see CPS intervening with the rich Long Island homes, where the parents are just likely to be arriving drunk at 9 p.m. and beat up their kids. In that sense, it is impossible to separate disability from other marginalized identities and from racism, from LGBTQ phobia, homophobia, transphobia, etc. And what should we do about it? Which is, we must see, I like to quote Doctor Who, paraphrase Doctor Who, in that sense, and talk about the idea that we often fail at seeing disability and advocacy as these separate movements, like here's disability, here's gender, here's immigration, here's racial justice. But instead of that, we need to see them as a singular big ball of wibbly wobbly activisty whiny stuff, basically. As a single broad social justice movement that is inexorably intertwined with each other. And if you can hear my dog in the background, I am so sorry. She's a foxhound. Imagine a beagle, but 70 pounds big, and just as loud as the beagle. So with that, Jesus Christ, I made this short, so it's almost 3:20. I put in my contact info, and I would like to open it up to people's questions, because every time I start off with this entire screen, I am only guessing what you want to hear and what are you talking about, what do you want to have questions about, and so on, especially with students who are the most curious folks. So I want to hear, what are the things you want me to answer questions-wise on this topic?
Well, we did have a question in the chat already, and it came from Margot Cole. And basically she's asking, do trans people have a shorter lifespan, statistically speaking, aside from the suicide rate?
Not that I know of. I don't think that part has been fully researched. There are rumors that float around on the internet that you're a lot more likely to die by age 30 and so on. I'm sure that when you factor in things like hate crimes, trauma, all the depression that comes from being treated like garbage by society, I'm sure that there is somewhat of a shorter lifespan, but I don't think it's that significant. Like, it wouldn't be decades and decades lower, but yeah.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask. I guess while we give folks a minute to compose their questions, I had a question. You know, what can people do to get involved in this wibbly wobbly movement that you were talking about? I
mean, I would say when you're looking at further work to do and extracurriculars, you should try to intern for social justice organizations in New York City. You have organizations like Sylvia Rivera Law Project, like Movement Advancement Project is also there. The Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund is based there, and whatnot. So I would say look up for internships, and in this sense, you can hassle Peter to look those opportunities up and make sure that they're disseminated and available, because I'm sure that through his role at the college, he can access more of those when people are recruiting students for that. And as far as your comment of a friend who is trans, it's okay to worry, but just being there for someone makes a lot of a difference, you know, just being and accepting, unconditionally accepting friendly friends. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I've already been trying to do that for her, and I notice just you know, encouraging her every day really seems to help a lot.
Well, I'll shoot with another question.
Okay.
So what could offices like mine do to address some of these issues that you presented to us today?
So in college and universities, you need to delve deeper into how accommodations work. Like almost everyone I know who's been out as disabled in a college, university, grad school, whichever level they've been in, has had to fight an uphill battle for the accommodations that they needed, often having to get all sorts of proof for it, often having to basically disclose their entire medical history, or for that matter, even having professors who don't honor those accommodations, and you have to fight them for that, which in turn creates this whole you're pushing against a situation where there is an invariably a disproportionate imbalance of power. And in the process, making those accommodations more accessible, more universally available, and also advocating for greater inclusion of online distance-based opportunities. Sorry. One thing that we learned with the pandemic is that Zoom can work, and that people who are immunocompromised or simply even who not, let's say you are completely immune to COVID, like you're immortal, you know? But if you have chronic pain that keeps you from getting out of bed some days, being able to attend class or have it recorded and watch it can make all the difference between that person passing the class or not, basically. It's harder to do with lab-based classes, since you kind of have to be there to manage substances, but you get my point.
Anyone in the audience have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I want to piggyback. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez Roldan. We initially talked a little bit at before about this accessibility, so I'm glad you're here. Boy, I really like how you talked about someone who wears glasses, right? Because I didn't even think about that, quite frankly, but it's so true. So I'm a counselor in the counseling center, and so when I talk, sometimes I also teach. So when I talk about accessibility services, I ask students to define what does that mean to you? What does disability mean to you, right? And I always get the standard answer. It's the physical disability that they think about. They never think about the other types of disabilities, right, that you defined here. And so in thinking about language, how can we begin to sort of change that break some of that thinking, right? Break down some of that thinking about how disability, and I'm definitely going to use some of what you described here when I talk about this topic with students. How do we begin to break down on what language can we be using or can we use to for people to broaden their definition about people with disabilities, for example. I think it's really important that we hopefully introduce it in a way that people can begin to see it as not just a physical or the scary ones, right? Because sometimes I even define the scary ones. Just like when I do counseling, there could be something there that I'm sensing. And so we're very cautious in terms of introducing a learning disability, for example, so that we can guide them to get services and that these services are accessible for them right on campus. Also kind of introducing that language in those moments, because I've had moments where I've talked to students and when we finally get to it, and they realize there could be something more than just not how they're defining themselves. I'm stupid. My teacher says that I'm not a good writer, all of these ideas. And when it comes down to it, it could be a learning disability that they have never been assessed for. So helping to guide that process for students, how can we introduce language and comfort for the entire college community so that we can use a unified language as well to introduce these topics. And, I have a little more, as a clinician, I'm looking at it from a different lens, but I think there's got to be kind of like a unified way in which we introduce this. And I know Accessibility Services is constantly doing stuff on campus to help students to understand that. But as a college, how can we do more?
So I would say one of the things is raise awareness about how broad the concept is, and try to kill the stigma around all disabilities. Because in the process of people not accepting or seeing themselves as such, they end up not accessing the protections that they deserve, basically. Like, if they don't see themselves as having a disability, they're not going to go seek that counseling or seek that accommodation or whatnot. And this is even more important when it comes to low-income students and whatnot, because they're less likely to have received any treatments or accommodations or diagnoses while through childhood and high school and so on. Basically, like, you're more likely to not have had those resources at school or have been able to afford providers that would provide an initial diagnosis and so on.
Can I?
Yeah, go.
I'm one of the people that looks at documentation of disabilities, and what I consistently find is a lot of times people don't know very much about their disability. And not only that, they have multiple disabilities. They're not thinking of that. And sometimes they're taking medication that impacts on their functioning. So sometimes it's going to be multiple things. And, we can discuss with them what might be helpful accommodations. But students, because they went through maybe kindergarten through high school and really didn't get a lot of information about what their disability is, come to college, don't know what the transition process is, don't know what's available to them, don't know how the disability impacts on them. There's an awful lot of information. I think that does not happen at the high school level, partially.
Yeah, and that is even more important in public universities, particularly CUNY, which tries to solve the whole city. But I would say additionally to that, when it comes to that topic, that is one big importance of why, if you ever have children, you should always make sure that they are empowered and know their diagnoses and know their treatment and have input on it, because otherwise you're hiding it as this horrible thing from them, while they know that they're different and will probably even get bullied for them.
Right.
And in the process, they will not be able to, when they're inevitably adults and have to be there for themselves, they won't be able to do that.
Or you'll find out in the process sometimes that there were things that they medically never followed up on, that they planned to, but they didn't, and it looks like there's an overlap. And so there's a lot of things that they need to know, and it's difficult. It really is. Just the medical system too, or, it really is difficult for a lot of people.
Yes, definitely. Are there more questions that people are thinking of? I've been loving the discussion so far, so keep it on.
Great. Well, I was thinking, along the lines of what we were just talking about is, like, what would be a good strategy to normalize disability, right? Because it could affect any one of us at any time in our lifespan. What's a good idea to normalize that for kids and then for college students?
I mean, I'm a big fan of using identity first language, but also when it comes to kids before college, that is why we often oppose segregated educational environments, like contained classrooms and so on, because otherwise you're not with your peers, you are you need to have integrated classrooms and avoid the language of special. You need to be clear that yes, you are disabled and that is perfectly okay. That isn't at all something bad. That's also why we're so adamant in identity first language at times. So additionally to that, I would also say when it comes to the college level, a lot of campaign and education about it. Like not just if you have a disability, come to us, to disability services or whatnot, or whatever other office does it in the institution, but also you might not even know that you have a disability. For example, all this list of things that you can get these services and helps and so on. Like that type of campaign would be essential, and make it part of all the processes, like all the school fairs where they're constantly giving out stuff, free stuff, and so on. That disability services people need to be there, basically, which is often not the case. I'm yet to see it in any academic institution I've been to or consulted with or taught on. And also, you need to go hard and make sure that there are consequences for professors and instructors that do not honor those accommodations, basically, because often just because you have a doctorate and are teaching college, they think they're gods in the classroom, basically. And postgraduate degrees kind of seem to come with illusions of grandeur, a black box labeled right there in the diploma. But I would say that they need to be aware that there are going to be consequences for not honoring those accommodations, like beyond just putting basic boilerplate language in their syllabus.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, don't be shy.
Also, by the way, if you have questions that you're afraid of asking in front of a crowd, even though I like having everyone make a fool out of themselves in front of others, not just myself, I don't like to have a monopoly on that. You can also reach out on Twitter or Twitter DMs or email. I'll probably be very delayed because I'm having major surgery next week, but you know, I'm writing my email.
Thank you.
I wish you luck with your surgery.
Thank you. Not everybody at once. Thank you.
As I told you, oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say thank you to the comments that say the school.
Yeah. Yesterday we, as I was telling you when we first got together today, student club on campus was discussing the terms normal, disability, person first versus identity first, and you already covered some of that. But what's your take on the term normal and what that means?
I mean, normal is kind of like a purple cow. I'm yet to see one. Basically, like, what even is normal? Do you want to be normal? Because that sounds boring. But like society seems to have an idea that it's supposed to be normal. And in reality, most people don't need it to some extent or other. Basically, we are all weird to some extent. But at the same time, the people who don't fit that mold of whatever is normal end up being excluded in different ways from society. So you need to really push back against that concept of this is what's normal and this is what is outside of normal. If 20% of the population is disabled, then we need to assume that that is part of what is normal, basically. Like that has to be the standard. And in the process, we can't just, like, if if you're sitting in a random room not related to disability, like random conference, random classroom, and you have to assume that at least 2 in 10 of those people, and picture it in a larger lecture hall, that's a fair amount of people, have some form of disability or other, possibly even more depending on how they identify or not identifying, then you need to treat it not as those people, but ourselves, basically.
Right. I agree.
And sort of accept the fact that sooner or later you'll be disabled, like old age comes to that sooner or later.
Right. We had a very interesting philosophical talk on the interdependence of people, right? And care, and it was very illuminating. We like to think of ourselves as independent, but we are all interdependent. No one of us can survive on our own.
Definitely.
Yet we other people all the time, like you said, in the name of classification or them not fitting a mold, etc. And here is the person who gave the lecture yesterday.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And thank you as well for the talk, Victoria, so far. Really interesting, informative. And since, Peter, you made reference to my talk yesterday, I was thinking about this question around, again, the idea of the normal. And that, of course, after I spoke then in the afternoon yesterday, there was that very interesting discussion by the students. I just want to make, I mean, whether it may be a question even, but again, the question was asked by Peter already, right? What, Victoria, you make of the normal. But I also wanted to share that I always speak about this question in my classes, and whether it's bioethics that I teach or political philosophy, other classes as well. And I want to share also the recent book that I often use with my classes. It's called The Normal and the Pathological, written many years ago by Georges Canguilhem, a French philosopher. Philosopher of science as well as a physician, I believe. And he speaks about the biological aspect of this, and therefore pathology within the field of medicine, and then also the social aspect of this. Very interesting, a classic. Then if you know the name of Michel Foucault, who also, worked a lot on these questions. Georges Canguilhem was one of Michel Foucault's teachers in France. But in any case, to understand, if I may actually elaborate perhaps on this, I mean, the way I understand also the very problematic question of the normal is that we have to understand the concept of the norm, first of all. And one interesting thing that Georges Canguilhem says in The Normal and the Pathological is that, I'm quoting, the norm in pathology, he says, is above all an individual norm. And because also, Victoria, you made reference to wearing glasses, that, I mean, I do too. I mean, my life would be, I would have a progressive situation whereby in the long run, I would lose my eyesight without wearing glasses. So that would be, but in any case, the question is, as Canguilhem, I believe, mentions at one point, someone who has a problem in that sense, who has poor vision, then cannot be a pilot, for example, cannot fly planes, right? So that's a limitation, because again, the idea of what we can do, what can a body do? I mean, that's what then, that's the ground for understanding the idea, not simply of a disability, but impairment to begin with. There are things that we cannot do, right? Just like in general, as human beings, our power is limited. We can't fly, but other living beings can fly, right? Birds and so on and so forth. So there are things that then individually we cannot do. And it is really, that's the problematic from a philosophical point of view and existential point of view, the problematic question with disability as well, because these impairments should not be used as a pretext for precisely then social, political discrimination and so on. I mean, and the same idea, another example coming from this book, certainly having and not having a heart condition is not the same. I mean, and if I develop at one point in my life a heart condition, that means that my norm has to change. It's not that I become abnormal because of that, but I had to adjust to a different norm. Right. So, I mean, the idea is to see not just one, and that's the problem with the idea of normalcy. And as Michel Foucault says, normalization. No one is normal to begin with. We become normal, in quote, because we are normalized. If I can't be normalized because I don't want to, because I resist this, or because I can't, then I fall into the category of the deviant, the abnormal, and so on and so forth. Right. So, I mean, I just wanted to, make this comment. I hope it's, and maybe get your response as well to what I say.
I mean, and I appreciate it, because you see the same thing with other forms of concepts. Like, we have been evolving slowly when it comes to saying what is normal, for example, what is sexually normal. And in the process, that definition has excluded for a very long time all sorts of LGBTQ identities, trans people, LGBT people in general. And I always find the concept of sexual normalcy hilarious, because it basically is denying that just about everyone has some deep stuff that they will not talk about. So there is no such thing as a sexual normalcy. It's a normal when it comes to sexuality, but that is a whole other topic. But yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you, and it is still part of the same type of logic that becomes then a repressive and oppressive logic. So it is very important. And actually, if I may, I mean, not that I want, but in my latest book that came out 2 years ago, I speak of this. I mean, basically in that book, because yesterday I presented from my 2010 book, but in my latest book, I try to engage in a deconstruction of the individual as such. I mean, the individual of the liberal tradition gets in the way of really, a liberation, a politics of liberation. So I replace the concept of the individual with the concept of the singular, where I say the singular is always plurally constituted, right? I mean, basically, I am not one, whether we're speaking about, my sexual identity or whatever, ethnic, national identity, and so on and so forth, whatever, social category of identity. I'm never simply one. I'm always more or less than one. I am a singularity where the singular is unique, whereas the individual is serialized. You have 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. Many individuals who then are easily stigmatized by the system. We are usually pushed in one box. We are assigned a label, and we can't move. I mean, you made reference also to the carceral, this discourse. I mean, the prison, again, and, criminal justice. I mean, the idea of the labels assigned to people such as the label of criminal. I mean, regardless of whether people are really guilty or not guilty, when they're found guilty, for example. But that is, again, a label which, once it is attached to an individual, then you can get rid of it, right? You cannot exit, right? So what I think is that we had to keep this idea of the multiplicities that we are, the plurality that we are within, and then also when we relate to others, other pluralities. I mean, I relating to you, it's not just one relating to another, but many relating to many already, right? Including at the sexual level. I completely agree. All these labels that we are forced to, accept, right? Even in terms of sexual orientation and so on and so forth, are ways of, and you spoke about the control, right? The society of control at one point, our way of controlling, right, our lives. Yes. Sorry for the length. this.
Oh, you're fine, Bruno.
We're starting to approach the final 15 minutes. So I kind of want to see what do the students want to say.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm only seeing a couple of students in the audience right now. So can one of them speak up, please? Or if I may, just verbalize something that I hear from students often. It's the idea of feeling misunderstood. And the typical tropes of not trying hard enough, or perhaps looking as if they do not have a disability, so they should be able to take a test in the usual amount of time, or don't need any extra time on an assignment. I mean, what would you say for students like that? How would they push back? How could they advocate for themselves in those cases?
Always take it, and I think this is where you need the support of the institution, why you need to reform the entire accommodations process, because, like, for example, I'm a member of the Disability Rights Bar Association, and it is a problem, a distinct problem, where we see regularly issues where attorneys have to get involved just to permit the rights of the students under the ADA and whatnot. So it is certainly a situation where it requires the support of the institution, and that is where I'm looking at the faculty to support those students. But yeah, 3:47 according to my computer.
I think one of the barriers, or this is what I hear from students, for them filing complaints and doing those kinds of things is that they're still in the course and they're worried about their grade and what the outcome is going to be. What do you?
Yeah, and that is why I keep pointing towards there need to be consequences for professors who don't honor accommodations, and the accommodations process needs to be streamlined and easy to get. I would rather accommodate more people than don't need it than to be denying accessibility to people who do need it, basically. And accessibility accommodations merely level the playing field. They do not create an advantage. And I think I'm seeing a comment from Deborah Dan about empathy as teachers. I'm going to go ahead and beg college professors and teachers in general, a significant amount of all of society's social rules can be summarized, and forgive the language, in the words, don't be a dick to people. Please don't be mean to your students. Be kind, But yeah.
And what accountability measures have you seen that have been effective?
Well, that's the problem. I rarely see them, especially in people who have tenure. They're more likely to get in trouble because they said something controversial about Israel than for abusing their students, to be very honest. So I would say ensure that codes of conduct for not accommodating students, for mistreatment of students, and so on, are enforced, and that there is actually HR consequences, because they still have to follow the law and the rules of the institution, regardless of tenure. Because it's easy with the adjuncts, since you can just say, we will not renew your contract. Like that can be the best consequence, the lightest one. But But you need to address the fact that many people in the tenure system, and I believe in the existence of tenure, it ensures free the liberty of academia when it comes to taking positions, but it cannot be a blank check to allow students to be above the fray. It doesn't make you immune to consequences of bad actions. And as a side note, I would say these are things that are required by law, both federal law and in the case of New York, state and the city human rights law. So.
Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience? And feel free to post it in the chat. I can verbalize it.
I had one other question. I saw, some going back and forth online about this. It seemed to be, trans individuals talking about this. Have you ever seen an instance where a trans individual has been denied like healthcare for like another physical or mental disability because it's assumed that the problem is stemming from the trans treatment instead of the existing condition that happened maybe before they transitioned or whatever?
I mean, it has its own name, which is called trans broken bone syndrome, like where we see, especially in mental health, you see it a lot, where it's like, oh, but I'm depressed. Oh, it must be your hormones. It must be the fact that you're trans. Or for that matter, no, we cannot give you gender affirming treatment until we cure your autism, for example. Yeah, I've seen that one. Look at my paper if there's an example, and it didn't end well, unfortunately. But I would say that one of the things to keep in mind, and we also see it, doctors trying to blame hormones or other gender affirming treatments for whatever illness or condition arises. And in the process, you're essentially denying the fact that trans people can have health issues, can have disabilities, can have illnesses, and so on. But that addresses more to the topic of literacy among doctors. And we often talk about doing continuing ed and training to providers, and in the process fail to address the fact that schools are rarely doing it, that you need to integrate that type of training into trans healthcare and so on at the nursing school level, at the physician assistant school level, at the pre-med level, at the medical school level, and so on. And if you have a nursing concentration in your studies, you should think about that even more, or pre-med students flying around.
So how common is that problem? Like how often does that happen of a healthcare issue?
I would say I don't know the numbers off the top of my head because I haven't read them in a couple months, mainly because I wasn't expecting to answer this question. But I would
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Look up the U.S. Trans Survey. It's a bit older now. I'm writing in. It's from 2015. The National Center for Transgender Equality wants to prepare a new one for 2022 this year. They were going to do it in 2020, but a couple things happened during that period. So I would urge you to look at the healthcare part, because there are many instances of people who've delayed healthcare precisely because of their being trans and fear of mistreatment. And they do that survey and they ask the questions and have the percentages.
Ew, that's horrible. Thank you though for telling me. I didn't know.
You're one of today's lucky 10,000 who learned in the thing.
Yes, that's true.
Well, I know there's at least 17 other people here that are lucky enough to have learned at least one new thing. And anyone have any other questions or wrapping thoughts?
We have 5 minutes, so go for it.
Okay. Well, do you have any closing thoughts for us? You know, any advice?
Honestly, to the students, use your privilege if you have it and stand up for injustices that you see in the classroom and in the university if you can safely do so. But for the faculty and staff here, try to reform the institution and also be kind to your students, especially.
Yeah, those can be the new golden rule.
Yeah. Don't be a dick to people.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this very informative talk. Thank you for, you know, the people who came to experience this talk and who participated. I think this is a good way to wrap Disability Awareness Week 2022 with kind of a kick in the pants and a charge to try to make things better and to, as you said, reform.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, as Margot said, I wish you all the best with the surgery next week, and I hope that that you remain well and that our paths cross again.
Okay.
Yes, same for me. Same for me. Thank you, Victoria, again, if I may, and thank you all.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Well, you take care, and to all my colleagues, you take care as well, and hope to see everyone soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Right.